Everybody enjoys a balanced sounding mix. When each element in the song is sitting in its own pocket, we're able to perceive the music better because we can hear things more clearly. The guitar isn't covering up the vocal, the bass isn't smothering the punch of the kick drum, and the brightness of the hi-hats isn't overwhelming and jarring to the ear. But how do we achieve this so-called balance? Well, in this video, I'm going to share with you 5 easy and effective tips that you can implement into your own mixing workflow to make your mixes sound more well-rounded and balanced. So let's hop right in and get to it. Number 1, leveling. This is the most basic and fundamental part of mixing, but it's really going to serve as the foundation of your mix. Before adding compression and EQ or any other effect, you have to set the levels of each track within your mix. But knowing where to set the volume of your vocals, your instruments, your drums is a skill that you as a mixer will have to develop over time. And there isn't some magical preset or exact volume level that I can tell you to set each of your tracks at. Every mix is going to be different, so you have to trust your ears when leveling out your mix. But here's some advice that I have for you. You want your kick and your snare drum to be the loudest tracks within your song. So I would suggest setting the levels of these first before setting the levels of anything else. My recommendation would be to start with your kick drum first and set it anywhere between -10 and -6 decibels. Then bring in your snare drum and use your ears to set it at a healthy volume level in relation to your kick. The kick and the snare feed off of each other, so you'll know just by hearing the kick drum how loud to set your snare. Don't focus on the actual numerical value of your snare drum's volume. The kick and the snare should be going back and forth. They're going to serve as the life of your song, and it's very critical that you set the volume level of these two elements at a healthy distance away from 0 decibels. You want to leave yourself some headroom because as you bring in other tracks, your mix will start peaking at a higher level. You want to leave yourself some space away from 0 decibels for the mastering engineer, whether that's going to be you or someone else, to add those final touches and effects to your mix. And since the kick drum is usually the loudest track within your song, setting it safely away from 0 decibels ensures that you leave yourself enough headroom. Let's take a listen as I set the levels for my kick and snare. Pay attention to how loud they are hitting and where my levels are at on this meter over here on the left side of the mixer. Next, I like to bring in the bass or the 808, whatever it is that is occupying the low end of your mix. And a lot of beginners will often make the mistake of setting the bass or 808 way too loud. So let's take a listen as I slowly bring up the level of the 808 in this song. So as you heard, I didn't bring up the level on the 808 to a crazy high volume. You don't want the 808 or the bass to overpower the kick drum. Its role is to fill out the bottom end of the mix. Now, there are certain situations in genres like hip hop, for instance, where you really want that heavy bass that's punching through the speakers. And there are ways to achieve this effect without necessarily bumping up the volume fader. But for this tutorial, we're simply focusing on balance. Next, let's bring in the main melody of the song, which in this case is the guitar. And setting the level of this is all based on the feeling of the song. The last thing we're going to do is set the volume level for the hi-hats, which, like the bass, is something that a lot of beginners will have the tendency to make too loud. The hi-hats are the groove of the song, so you really don't want them to be too quiet, but you also don't want them to stick out too much. Okay, so now we have a nice and leveled piece of music that we can use as the foundation of our mix. These are the main elements that everything else is going to feed off of. Typically, I like to set these first because I like to know the landscape and playing field that I have for my vocal. The second tip I have for you is stereo placement, and this basically involves the location of where you place each element within your song. Now you have the center of your mix and you have the left and right side of your mix, which is commonly referred to as the side. Typically, you're going to want your kick, your snare, your bass, and your vocal to be placed directly in the center of your mix. And for the most part, everything else is going to be spaced out or panned to the left and right to basically surround what we have placed in the middle of our mix. Everything that's placed in the middle of the mix is going to be up front and in your face, and then everything that's on the sides is going to act as the supporting cast. Now, as far as panning goes, don't just start placing things to the left and to the right side of your mix. You really want to pan with a plan. And I personally like to pan things in pairs. So for instance, you're going to see here that I'm panning my guitar 50% to the left. Well, in order to balance things out, I'm going to look for another sound that I can pan 50% to the right, which in this case is going to be the second electric guitar. So let's go ahead and take a listen to how these two sound. All right, so it's really giving me a wider sounding mix while also moving things away from the center and making room for the vocal and the bass and the kick and snare. And typically I like to do this same concept with my hi-hats and cymbals. The hi-hats will go 25% to the right and the cymbals will go 25% to the left. There's really so many ways you can utilize panning to achieve balance within your mix. But just remember, you never want to overload one side of your mix, so you always want to pan things in pairs to the best of your ability. The third tip to getting a balanced mix is utilizing EQ to shape the frequency content of every sound within your mix. This is going to help create space for every single track within the song. Removing the unnecessary low frequencies from the tracks that don't need those low frequencies is the bare minimum that you should be doing as far as EQ goes. Doing so is really going to open up the low end for instruments that actually utilize the low end frequencies like the kick drum, the 808, the bass guitar. So either use a high pass filter or a low shelf curve to remove the low frequencies from the sounds that don't need them. But be careful to not go too far and take away too many low frequencies from a sound because you will risk making it get lost in the mix because it sounds too weak. Let's take a listen as I EQ this electric guitar. You want to do this for everything in your mix. Try to carve away and open up room for your low end. The next tip that I have for a balanced mix is to make sure that your low frequencies are in mono. And if you don't know what that means, let me explain. Audio signal can be played in two different ways, mono or stereo. Mono is where you have the same audio signal being played through the left and right speaker, whereas a stereo signal can be played back through the left side, right side, or center position of your mix, resulting in a greater sense of width. And the reason that we want our low frequencies to be placed in mono is because the human ear has trouble distinguishing the direction of which it hears bass frequencies coming from. So there's really no benefit to having your low end placed in stereo because it could result in phase cancellation and balance issues when playback on certain devices. I like to use this mono maker knob right here found on the Shadow Hills mastering compressor. I usually experiment with what frequency set point I use, but a good rule of thumb is making everything below 100 Hertz mono. Another good plugin for this is Vitamin made by Waves. This allows you to set frequency bands across your mix and adjust the stereo image of each band, which in this case will set the band at 100 Hertz and then pull down on the stereo image to make it mono. This will really tighten up the low end and make sure the low end is ready for playback across all devices. The fifth and final tip that I have for you to achieve a balanced mix is to utilize busing within your mixing workflow. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what busing is, it's basically a way for you to group your tracks together in separate subgroups and then bring all those subgroups together on your mix bus bus or master channel. So for instance, you're gonna have all of your drums going to a drum bus, you're gonna have all of your instruments going to an instrument bus, and then you're gonna have all of your vocals going to a vocal bus. This allows you to have more large-scale control over the processing of your mix because you can make adjustments to each group before they all join together as one. You can add EQ, saturation, compression to glue your drums together without affecting everything else in the mix. You can bring the brightness up on all of your instruments at once without making the top end of the drums or the vocals sound too harsh. Utilizing busing is just going to give you the ability to glue everything together, which ultimately is going to give you a more balanced mix. All right, so that's it for today. I hope you all enjoyed the content. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. Leave me a comment, let me know what y'all think, and I'll see you on the next video.